In this video, I'm going to weigh in on this very important question. If you're an artist looking to buy a fountain pen with a flexible gold nib for drawing, should you buy a vintage or a modern pen? As a professional artist who collects vintage and modern flexible pens and uses them regularly, I believe I can offer a useful opinion to those new to the fountain pen game. I'm going to compare the performance of a range of modern and vintage pens, talk about their advantages and disadvantages, and then at the end, give you my recommendation for what to get. Before I begin, I should emphasize that I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who exclusively draws with his pens. I don't do calligraphy, which is a different art form, with its own requirements from its tools. I'm also speaking to people that are looking for a practical, reliable drawing instrument, not for a precious relic to occasionally disinterment, take a few photos for social media bragging rights, and then immediately return to its resting place. Now, let's define what I mean when I say a vintage fountain pen. There are actually two broad categories of vintage pens: pens that were made before World War II and pens that were made after World War II. More on this later in the video, but to keep things simple, for now we'll just group all of them together. Since there's no consensus on when the vintage period ends, I'm going to set the date at around 1970. I believe that's reasonable since the 70s saw the development of many of the popular models we see today, such as the Platinum 3776, the Pilot Vanishing Point, the Coeco Sport, etc. It's also really the point where most flex pens cease to be manufactured. At any rate, feel free to argue with me on this point or any other in the comments section. Many people in the fountain pen community consider vintage flex pens to be superior to modern flex and turn their noses at anything modern. Those people do have some valid points, so here are 4 things that make vintage flex better than modern flex. The first is degree of flexibility. There are many flexible vintage pens out there that can go from an extra fine to a double broad or even triple broad with ease, and in some extreme cases even beyond that. This degree of flexibility is not as common in modern flex pens, though it is possible. The thing to remember is that flexibility will vary greatly from flex pen to flex pen, and that not every vintage pen will outperform a modern pen. I have here 3 vintage flex pens that are some of my best performers. So here is a Wahl Eversharp Gold Seal. This is a really well-known pen. This is the Waterman 52, one of the more common vintage flex pens on the market. And then this is a Parker Jacknife Safety, recent purchase. All of these pens are from the 1920s and are sack fillers. Let's give them a shot. Let's start off with the Wahl Eversharp Gold Seal. So let's do a few little figure eights. Okay, that's about as comfortable as I am flexing the pen. Let's do a few little line tests this way. Nice flow. I really like that this pen starts off with an extra fine line. Then what else should I do? I don't know, let's do a little face doodle. Okay. Now let's go to the Waterman 52. Do the same thing. Interesting that both pens are filled with the same ink, yet the Waterman 52 puts down a line that's considerably darker. Okay, let's do another little face doodle. Let's do it here. Okay, and then lastly, let's do the Parker Jacknife Safety. Little pen, I'm going to post it. Alright, so let's do some figure eights here. Right, all 3 pens have the same ink in them. It's a gray ink made by Pilot, the name I can't remember right now. You can see that they have different degrees of flow, right? With the Waterman having a heavier flow, making the line darker. Okay, a little more flexible than the other 2 pens. And let's do another little face here. Okay. All right, now let's compare them to their modern competitors. Let's start off with the Pilot 743 FA. This is my favorite modern flex nib. Out of the box flex nib, anyway. Okay, let's do some line variation tests here. Okay, not too bad. Now let's do a little face. Okay. Now let's go to the Pilot Knife 12 FA. This is considered widely to be the best flexing modern pen. And you can see the flex is pretty great. It actually is as flexible as the Parker. Pretty good. Very, very juicy nib. Puts down a lot of ink. Okay, railroading a little bit, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Okay, little face doodle. Oh. And lastly, a pen that's a little bit harder to obtain. This is a standard number 6 14-karat gold Jowo nib, which was custom ground into a semi-flex by a company called FP Nibs, which is out of Spain. They do excellent nib customizations, different kinds of grinds. This is actually their semi-flex customization. They have a full flex, which I think is $70 more. But you can see that this pen is very flexible. Okay, a little bit of flow issue. Again, this can be a problem with modern flex pens, right? Issues of flow. But again, more on that later. So you can see that the degree of flex between the vintage and modern pens is actually pretty comparable. Now, can I get a vintage flex pen that is more flexible? Yes, I can. So there are kinds of pens, there are pens out there that are called wet noodles. Once again, they go from potentially extra fine line all the way to triple broad. The problem is that those pens are very highly sought after by collectors and are really costly. Right? You're going to pay a premium based on the flexibility of the pen. I'm not doing calligraphy, so I'm not doing a bunch of fancy curlicues. I'm drawing with these pens. And for drawing, this degree of flexibility is just about all I need. One thing that I do like about vintage flex is that the extra fine lines start out very, very fine, what some people call needle point. So you can see with the 3 vintage pens, the lines are very fine at the beginning without pressure and then go thicker. Whereas with the modern pens, the lines start off a little bit thicker. Now there is one modern flex pen where the line is that thin, and it's the Pilot Custom 74 with a soft fine nib. So it'll start off with a needle point and then go thicker, 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 thicker. But this pen doesn't have a lot of flexibility to it. You can see it's not quite as flexible as any of the flex pens here. The second reason why people consider vintage flex to be superior to modern flex is what's called snapback, how quickly the pen goes from full flex back to normal writing. While there are some modern pens, as we saw, that have vintage-like flexibility, particularly if they've been customized, they're usually a little bit squishier and a little bit slower to snap back to normal. So let's compare 2 pens, our Jacknife Safety, and let's do some snapback tests. One good test is simply this, right? Another good one is simply doing a face like this. You can see that the pen returns to normal instantly without any delay whatsoever. Writing is also a very good test of this, so let's write. Okay. And now let's compare that to our Pilot 912 FA. Let's do the same thing. And while the springiness here feels almost the same, I can feel a little bit slower to snap back. So this nib is great in terms of flexibility, but it feels a little bit squishier. It's a little bit slower to come back to normal. Now, of course, the difference is very slight. Now, the difference is most notable in my custom flex nib, this 14K Jowo nib, which is my most flexible writer, but also the squishiest, the slowest to come back to normal. Now, this might be a lot more important when you're doing calligraphy, where you have to go from thick to thin line in an instant. But for the artist, it's also of tremendous value, since it makes the nib feel more responsive, more sensitive to slight shifts in pressure. The third reason why many people prefer vintage flex, and this is a big one, is flow. Because a nib, no matter how flexible, is useless if not coupled with a feed that provides an adequate supply of ink. Vintage feeds for flex pens are usually generous and can keep up with ink demands of a nib even when heavily flexed and putting down lines very quickly. This is where modern flex pens run into a lot of trouble. So let's test out this Parker Jacknife. And let's speed up with our figure eights. Let's start flexing, and let's put down a bunch of fast hatching. And you can see that the pen has absolutely no problems keeping up. Let's do the same thing with the Wahl. Okay, you can see no issues whatsoever. Alright, now let's try the same thing with the Pilot Custom 912 FA. Let's speed up. Okay, we already have a little bit of railroading. Alright, now I have to wait a couple of seconds for the ink to go back into the channel. And let's see, okay, now we can go again. And once again, some problems with railroading. Look, this is the case with most modern flex pens. Let's try the same thing with the Pilot 743. Let's see how well it performs. Okay, so figure eight's not a problem. This is working better. And now let's do some fast hatching up. Okay. Okay, so you can see that it's run out of ink. Let's try this with the Jowo Custom. Okay, that's pretty good, pretty wet. And let's see, up. Okay, so a little bit of railroading here, but look, I really had to push this nib to the extreme. So is this a deal breaker? Well, not necessarily. It really depends how often you push the nib to this much pressure to this much speed. If that's not really part of your drawing style, then it's not really a big deal. But just keep in mind that vintage pens perform a lot better in that respect. Now, there is a fairly simple fix for these two pens, the Pilot pens. You can go to the Flexible Nib Factory, it's a website, and buy Ebonite feeds for these two pens. And then you can replace this plastic feed, which sort of kind of keeps up under most writing situations, and put in an Ebonite feed that has a little more flow. And you have the option of putting a 2-channel feed or a 3-channel feed into it. I actually have both of them, but I haven't felt the need to replace the feeds because, look, again, it really depends how often you push the pen to this extreme. I think for most drawing purposes, the flow in both these pens is perfectly fine. Another reason why people prefer vintage flex over modern flex is variety. Vintage flex nibs were made by a lot of different manufacturers for a long period of time. They came in many different sizes, flexibilities, and flow. That means every time you get a flex pen, even if it's from the same manufacturer in roughly the same time period, you'll experience something a little different. So for example, this is a Pelikan 140, and even though it's supposed to be a fine, it puts down a kind of thick, almost medium-like line. And then this is a Pelikan 400 NN from the same time period, and it's also supposed to be a fine, yet it puts down a line that is a lot thinner. So this is like an extra fine, and this nib doesn't quite have as much flex to it, though it's not bad. A little bit scratchier, very different experience in terms of writing and drawing. Here's another comparison. This is from an older pen. This is a Waterman 72.5. It features a number 2 flexible nib. Very precise, very thin, semi-flex nib. Beautiful, precise, sharp lines. And let's compare that to a Waterman 52. Where's it? This one here, which also features a number 2 nib with, you can see, slightly shorter tines, yet it's the more flexible nib. A little wetter, definitely more flexible. So here we have two pens with supposedly the exact same number 2 nib, yet very different. Now, obviously with modern flex, you do have variety as well, but nowhere close to approaching the type of variety you can get in vintage flex. The fifth and probably most surprising reason why many people prefer vintage to modern is the price. Many vintage flex pens can be bought for well under $150. So for example, in my collection, only these 3 pens are above $200. This is a Waterman 54, by the way, which is a sought-after collector's item. Then this pen was about $170, which is actually a very good price for this Pelikan 400. And then the rest under $150, with the bottom 2 being under $100. $400, the only thing you get on the modern side is this pen, which is a Pilot Custom 74 with a soft, fine nib. This is an excellent pen, which I really strongly recommend, but it is semi-flex. Then, going up in price, we have the Pilot Falcon, which nowadays runs about $180. Also semi-flex. Again, highly recommended. I like this pen a lot, but it is a semi-flex pen. Let's compare that to this $80 or $90 Wahl Eversharp Skyline. And you can see that it actually outperforms both these pens and is actually a little bit of a smoother, more flowing drawing instrument. When it comes to custom flex, it's also not cheap. So my cheapest custom flex pen is this one. So the nib was bought for about $70, and then I paid another $50 to have it customized for flex. So the nib itself ran about $130 altogether, and then you still have to buy a pen body. Now, I could have put this in a much cheaper pen body, like a $16 TWSBI Go, but do you really want to put an expensive custom flex gold nib into a cheap pen body? No. This is why I went with a TWSBI Mini, which is a really great combination with this nib. It works excellently. But again, not a cheap option. And then things go rapidly up in price. So with the Pilot pens, the 912, which I bought used, but new runs $225. Then we've got the Pilot 743 FA, which is going to run you closer to $275. So as you can see, vintage flex for the most part, and you can obviously pay more. You can pay thousands and thousands of dollars for a vintage flex pen, but you can easily get a really nice vintage flex pen for under $150, and then if you're lucky, even under $100. Now on to the disadvantages of vintage flex. The first and probably most important is fragility. The vintage flex pen you buy will be, following my definition, at least 50 years old, and as with people, that comes with wear and tear. Flex nibs undergo a lot of stress in their lives, in part because many users push the pen to its limits, which over time can cause the tines of the nib to spring, crack, or break. Since it's often difficult to know the condition of the nib from pictures or how the previous owner treated it, there's always a risk that the pen you're buying is a ticking time bomb. So for example, this Waterman 52 with excellent flex has a little tiny hairline crack opening up in the breather hole, which if I'm not careful, if I put too much flex in the pen, might open up and ruin the nib. The pen body also needs to be considered, though there are many examples of vintage pens in perfect condition. Pens made before 1920 tended to be made of Ebonite, a hard vulcanized rubber that is durable but brittle and can shatter like glass if dropped on a hard surface. Later pens are made from celluloid, which is more resistant to shattering but prone to shrinkage. With both materials, extra care has to be taken, which means that these pens should be handled and stored very carefully. The second disadvantage is leaking. There's a reason why people used to wear pocket protectors. The feeds in vintage fountain pens, as I mentioned, are generous. That generosity comes at a price, since vintage pens are much more subject to dripping and burping. Most of my vintage pens will drip if shaken slightly, and if you store them in any position other than the nib up, they will leak into the cap and into your pants pocket. So for instance, this is the Parker Jacknife Safety. You can see with a slight shake, it'll drip ink everywhere. Waterman 52. The same. Waterman 72. And the Wahl. Right, all of them will drip. The same will not happen with any of the modern flex pens, particularly the Pilots, which are very reliable and mostly drip free. So this is the Pilot 912 FA, not a problem. Let's try this with a Falcon. No issues at all. the 743, again, no problem. Up, a little bit of a drip. And let's give our custom flex a try as well. Okay, also not a problem. Now this dripping won't happen with every vintage flex pen. So for instance, the Pelikan 140, this is full of ink and doesn't drip. Let's try it with the other Pelikan. Let's see how it does. Okay, also not a problem. So not every vintage flex pen will do this, but most of them, particularly if they have very generous feeds, will. Now, is that a big deal? Well, if you plan on carrying your pens everywhere, definitely yes. You don't want to throw your vintage pens into a bag or go for a jog with them in your pocket. So they're not really that great for portable outdoor sketching where you're moving around a lot and shaking your pen. However, if you're using your pens at home in your studio, just make sure you store them nib up and you won't have any problems whatsoever. The third disadvantage are the filling systems. There's a reason why many of those systems used in old fountain pens are no longer used. Sac fillers, the most common filling system in vintage pens, has a lot of drawbacks. Not only is the ink capacity minuscule, there's also no way of knowing how much ink is in your pen, and there's no way of cleaning the pen thoroughly if you want to switch inks. Perhaps that wasn't a problem back in the day when the only ink options available were black and blue, but now with thousands of ink options, it is an issue. The fourth disadvantage might not be a problem for artists who are comfortable using drawing materials of different sizes, but it's this. Vintage pens are mostly small. Pen manufacturers did offer larger pens called oversize, but there were unusual and luxury offerings. Most pens were thin and small, such as this Waterman 52, or even smaller, like this Waterman 72.5. I don't know what's responsible for the gigantomania in modern pen manufacturing, but pens today are much larger than their vintage predecessors. When Montblanc released its 149 in the 1950s, it was considered huge. It's still a big pen, but there are plenty of pens that are as big or even larger. So for instance, both the Pilot 743 and 912 are pretty close in size, and these two Demonstrator pens by Opus 88 are even a little bit larger. So if you're used to working with larger pens, you might find that unless you pay a premium for an oversized vintage pen, you'll have to settle with something on the smaller side. Again, that's not a big deal with most artists since we're used to working with very narrow drawing and painting implements. So for instance, a thin little brush like this, which is much narrower than any of these. And now for the last and probably biggest disadvantage, the difficulty in obtaining the pen you want for a price you're willing to pay. I mentioned that vintage flex is less expensive than modern flex, but unlike purchasing a modern flex pen, which usually requires a few clicks, getting a vintage pen requires a considerable amount of research and persistence. Unlike a modern pen where you're able to know exactly what you're getting, with vintage there's always some risk of disappointment. This is a big topic, however, and I'm working on a separate video where I'll give you tips on how to purchase a vintage pen. Alright, now let's talk modern pens. As with vintage, it's difficult to talk about all modern gold flex as one category, but the main separation is between out-of-the-box flex and custom flex. As for the flex pens that are out of the box, my experience is limited to the pens made by Pilot. So here I have the Falcon and the Pilot Custom 74 Soft Fine. Both these are semi-flex pens. And then I've got the Pilot 912 FA, which is widely considered to be one of the best modern flex pens out there. And then also the Pilot 743 FA, which is not quite as flexible as the 912, but also very well considered. As for custom flex, I have 3 modern nibs that have been customized. These 2 were customized by FP Nibs, which is a Spanish company that specializes in all different kinds of nib grinds and obviously flex customization. And then a recent purchase, a custom flex nib from Custom Nib Studio out of Los Angeles. I also have a standard soft 14K nib, which is made by Jowo, which is very, very close to semi-flex. As I see it, the main advantage of all the modern flex pens are the modern pen bodies that come with them. In the case of the Pilot pens, they're very solidly built and are cartridge converters, which make them versatile and easy to clean. In the case of the custom flex nibs, I have each of them in a pen body that I really love. This flex nib is in an Opus 88 Demonstrator, this one is an Opus 88 Omar, this one is an Opus 88 Picnic, and this one is in one of my favorite pocket pen bodies, the TWSBI Mini. All 4 of these pens are very functional demonstrators with large ink capacity, and in terms of practicality, they leave vintage pens in the dust. Another advantage is that, for the most part, modern pens do not drip when writing or when stored. As I mentioned, I would never keep a vintage pen in my pocket, but will carry any one of these, especially the Opus 88s, anywhere, including an airplane. Another advantage is the peace of mind of knowing exactly what you're getting. When you buy a new pen, you know that it will be in new condition. You don't have to worry about previous wear and tear, unless of course you buy the pen used. With vintage pens, there are a lot of potential unseen problems. Ink sacs that work but are about to harden, tipping material that's almost gone, a filling mechanism that's about to break. With a new pen, no such worries. Furthermore, there's no scavenger hunt for the right pen at the right price. You get the pen you want, when you want it, at the price you expect. So, there's my breakdown of the advantages and disadvantages of vintage and modern flex. So what's my recommendation? Setting aside the issue of price, it really comes down to what you want to do with your pen. If you need a pen you can put in your pocket or a pen case without worry, go with a modern pen. If you're planning to work outdoors or travel, especially on a plane, definitely go with a modern pen. Also, if you want to change ink frequently or use waterproof ink, go with a modern pen. However, for studio use, nothing quite beats the springiness or responsiveness of a vintage pen. This is why I use both vintage and modern flex in my art practice. That said, a great compromise between the two are these semi-flex pens from the post-war period, specifically from Germany. Pre-war flex pens are usually the ones that flex aficionados rave over and collect rapaciously. Post-war pens are less collected, because those pens are usually semi-flex and are less flashy. But these pens are often quite sturdy and in good states of preservation, being made of modern plastics, and better yet, these have piston filling systems that provide ample ink capacity and ink windows that let you see if you're low on ink. These pens work absolutely great, having just enough flex for the line variation requirements of drawing. They also have great filling systems, and most importantly, they don't drip or leak like most pre-war flex pens tend to do. So I feel perfectly comfortable taking them out of my studio, but I still wouldn't use them with waterproof ink since I have no idea how to take these apart. Here are the post-war semi-flex pens in my collection. The first one is the Pelikan 140. This is a pen from the 50s which can be found under $150. Pelikans tend to write a little bit on the wider and wetter side, so even though this is a fine nib, it writes a little bit more like a medium. Again, this is a semi-flex pen. It has a piston and you can see through the pen, so you can tell exactly how much ink you have. And then this is a slightly more expensive pen, the 400NN. And we're talking about varieties of nibs. The fact that this is both a fine, yet writes with a much finer, slightly scratchier line. Very comparable to the Pilot 74 or the Pilot Falcon, but again, this is a piston filler. It has an ink window. You can see through the plastic here to tell exactly how much ink you have. Now, another great option are these two pens made by Montblanc. This is the Montblanc 342G, this one here, and the Montblanc Monte Rosa. Both were entry-level pens that were manufactured in great numbers starting in the 50s and I believe through the 70s. Now, don't get thrown off by the fact that they're Montblanc. These vintage pens date back to when Montblanc was still manufacturing pens and not status objects. So here is the 342G. Very, very smooth. Very comparable to the Pilot 743 FA, but a lot less expensive. And then here's the Monte Rosa, a little bit less flex on this one, so comparable to the Pilot Falcon or the 743, excuse me, the Pilot 74 soft fine nib. And in all four cases, these pens will not drip on you, and I feel perfectly comfortable keeping them in my wallet, my pocket, or throwing them into a case. They're very reliable. Not as flashy as the pre-war vintage flex pens, but a really great option for anyone that is looking for vintage, but also wants to carry their pens around in their case and sketch outdoors. I should also mention that it's possible to fit a vintage nib into a modern pen body, which I think is the ideal solution, marrying the superiority of the vintage nib with the superiority of a modern body. There are a few companies that will occasionally sell these kinds of hybrid pens, but you can also do it yourself. Here are two modern pens, both Noodlers, that have been fitted with vintage flex nibs. This one is a Boston Safety pen, which I fitted with a Parker nib that I bought online, and it works absolutely great. So now I've got a perfect marriage of the fantastic performance of a vintage nib with the durability of a modern pen body. And then my cheapest vintage flex pen, which is a $16 Noodler's Creeper, which I fitted with a gold nib from a Ingersoll dollar pen that I bought at a thrift store for about $10. Also works great. I think for most of us, a Gold Flex fountain pen is a pretty significant investment, and the huge range of options out there make purchasing one a daunting process. Take your time and do your research, and recognize that no pen is going to be perfect in terms of flex, flow, filling system, weight, balance, etc. This is why I have so many Flex pens in my collection, and chances are, once you get into buying fountain pens, you will too. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have questions or comments, leave them below, and I'll be happy to respond.